Those ribbons. They stopped issuing those in 2003. The words cut through the morning air like a blade. Colonel Harrison Vance stood frozen, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, staring at the faded uniform of the woman walking past the mess hall. What had started as routine laughter from a group of young recruits suddenly died into uncomfortable silence as every eye turned to see what had made the old colonel's face drain of all color. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Just moments before, the atmosphere at Fort Meridian had been typical for a Tuesday morning. Fresh recruits were shuffling through breakfast, their pressed uniforms crisp and badges gleaming when she walked in. The woman couldn't have been more than 5'2", with graying auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing what looked like a uniform that had seen better decades. The fabric was faded, the edges frayed, and the whole ensemble looked like something pulled from a thrift store or a military surplus bin that had been forgotten in someone's garage. "Look at that antique," whispered Private Thompson, barely containing his snicker as he nudged his table-mate. "Did she get that uniform from a museum?" The comment sparked a ripple of quiet laughter from the surrounding tables. Here were these young soldiers, fresh from basic training, their own uniforms still bearing the sharp creases from the quartermaster, looking at this woman like she was some kind of relic from a bygone era. The woman's name was Elena Kovac, though nobody bothered to ask. She moved through the mess hall with quiet dignity, her posture straight despite the weight of countless stares and barely concealed mockery. Her boots were scuffed leather, the kind that had walked countless miles, and her utility belt carried the basic gear of someone assigned to maintenance duties around the base. To most observers, she looked like exactly what her paperwork said she was: a civilian contractor responsible for equipment maintenance and facility upkeep. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" asked Sergeant Rodriguez, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone addressing a lost tourist. "The civilian contractors usually eat in the other facility." His voice carried that particular mix of professional courtesy and gentle condescension that military personnel often used when dealing with what they perceived as confused civilians who had wandered into military spaces. Elena simply nodded toward her ID badge and continued to the serving line. The mess hall staff, mostly young enlisted personnel doing their rotation through kitchen duty, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Here was this woman in a uniform that looked like it belonged in a military history textbook, claiming a place among active duty personnel. Some of the younger soldiers began pulling out their phones, clearly thinking this would make for an amusing social media post about the wannabe soldier who'd shown up to breakfast in costume. But it was the details that should have given them pause, if anyone had bothered to look closely. The way Elena carried herself wasn't the uncertain gait of someone playing dress-up. Her movements were economical, purposeful, the kind of controlled precision that came from years of military bearing. When she reached for her tray, her stance naturally provided clear sight lines to all exits. When she chose her seat, it was positioned with her back to the wall and facing the main entrance. These weren't conscious choices, they were ingrained habits, the kind that became second nature after years of operational awareness. The real tell was in the small things that the laughing recruits completely missed. The way her eyes automatically cataloged every person in the room, assessing potential threats and escape routes. The way she sat with perfect posture without seeming to think about it. The way she ate efficiently, purposefully, like someone who had learned to consume calories quickly, because you never knew when the next meal might come. But most telling of all was the way she seemed completely unbothered by the whispers and stares, as if she'd long ago learned to tune out the opinions of people who didn't matter. "I bet she bought that whole getup online," continued Private Thompson, his voice carrying further than he probably intended. "You can get anything on those military surplus sites. probably think she looks authentic." His comment drew more chuckles from the surrounding tables, and a few more phones appeared as soldiers began documenting what they saw as an amusing morning entertainment. That's when Colonel Vance walked in. Harrison Vance was a man who commanded respect through presence alone. 32 years of service, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, and enough commendations to wallpaper a small room. He'd seen everything the military had to offer, from the best of humanity to the absolute worst, and very little surprised him anymore. He walked into the mess hall expecting nothing more than his usual morning coffee and perhaps a few words with the duty sergeant about the day's training schedule. Instead, he found himself staring at a ghost that it wasn't the woman herself. That stopped him cold. It was what she was wearing. Because while every young soldier in that room saw a faded, outdated uniform that looked like a costume, Colonel Vance saw something entirely different. He saw ribbons and insignia that told a story most people weren't authorized to know. He saw service markers that hadn't been issued in over 2 decades. He saw the kind of decorations that came with security clearances so high that their very existence was compartmentalized information. The mess hall continued its morning routine around them, unaware that they were witnessing the moment when 2 worlds, the visible military of parades and ceremonies and the shadow military of operations that never happened, were about to collide in the most unexpected way. Elena Kovac had walked into Fort Meridian thinking she could blend into the background, just another maintenance worker in an old uniform. She had no idea that her past was about to catch up with her in the form of a colonel who still remembered when legends walked among them, wearing their stories on their chests for those who knew how to read them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena Kovac, 48 years old, stood exactly 5 feet 2 inches tall with a frame that seemed almost delicate until you noticed the way she moved. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was always pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her face during work. Deep green eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing sat beneath eyebrows that had long ago learned not to furrow at the opinions of others. She had been working at Fort Meridian for 8 months now, arriving each morning at precisely 0630 hours in her weathered Honda Civic that had seen better decades. Her official title was Maintenance Contractor General Services, a designation that covered everything from HVAC repair to groundskeeping, plumbing to electrical work. The kind of catch-all position that made her invisible to most of the base personnel who saw her as just another civilian keeping the infrastructure running. Elena's daily uniform was always the same. That faded military-style jacket that had once been forest green but had weathered to something closer to sage, matching pants that bore the telltale signs of countless repairs, and boots that were polished but clearly ancient. The fabric showed wear patterns that spoke of years of use, not costume party rental. The jacket hung loose on her small frame, but it was tailored properly, the kind of fit that suggested it had once been custom-made, rather than issued from a standard supply room. Most people assumed she was some kind of military enthusiast. Maybe a veteran's widow who wore her deceased husband's old gear out of sentiment. The truth was simpler and more complex. These weren't costume pieces or hand-me-downs. This uniform had been hers, earned through service that most people couldn't imagine, and worn through operations that officially never happened. Her work area was a small office attached to the main maintenance shed, equipped with a metal desk that had seen better decades, a computer that ran military logistics software, and filing cabinets filled with work orders, equipment manuals, and maintenance schedules. The walls were bare, except for a standard issue calendar and a corkboard covered with repair requests and inventory lists. No personal photos, no decorations, no hints about who Elena Kovac might have been before she became the woman who fixed things that broke, But there were details that told a different story, for those who knew how to look. Elena's toolkit was organized with military precision, every item in its designated place, maintained to standards that exceeded most professional mechanics. Her workspace was clean to the point of being sterile, with everything positioned at exact right angles and labeled with the kind of meticulous care that suggested someone who had learned that disorder could mean death. The way she carried herself spoke of training that went far beyond basic maintenance work. When Elena walked across the base, her stride was measured, efficient, the kind of movement that covered ground quickly without appearing hurried. She never took the same route twice in a row, always varying her path in subtle ways that seemed random but followed patterns that would be familiar to anyone trained in operational security. Her hands told their own story. Calloused from years of manual work, yes, but also scarred in ways that suggested more than routine equipment repair. Small marks that could have come from field stripping weapons in darkness. A barely visible line across her palm that looked suspiciously like it might have come from razor wire. Fingers that moved with the kind of dexterity that came from working with precision instruments under pressure. Elena spoke when spoken to, responded to work requests promptly and professionally, and otherwise kept to herself. She ate lunch alone, usually something simple she brought from home, reading technical manuals or maintenance procedures while she ate. During breaks, she could often be found studying equipment diagrams or updating maintenance logs with the kind of detailed documentation that exceeded anything required by her contract. The younger soldiers barely noticed her, except as a fixture of base life. She was the woman who fixed the broken air conditioning in the barracks during summer, who ensured the backup generators were always ready, who somehow managed to keep decades-old equipment running smoothly through a combination of technical skill and what seemed like mechanical intuition. What they didn't notice was how Elena positioned herself during her work, how she always kept situational awareness of everyone around her, how she instinctively chose locations that provided cover and concealment, how she worked with one ear always tuned to radio chatter and bass announcements, as if she were constantly monitoring for information that might be relevant to something more important than plumbing repairs. Her civilian contractor status meant she had access to most areas of the base, but she never went anywhere she didn't have explicit authorization to be. She followed protocols with the kind of rigid adherence that suggested someone who understood that rules existed for reasons that weren't always obvious. When security procedures changed, Elena adapted immediately, without questions or complaints, as if operational security was second nature to her. In the 8 months she'd been at Fort Meridian, Elena Kovac had become part of the background, as unremarkable and reliable as the sunrise. The base ran more smoothly with her there, equipment failures decreased, and response times for repairs improved dramatically. But to most observers, she was just the quiet woman in the old uniform who showed up, did her job, and went home without fanfare. What none of them realized was that Elena's greatest skill wasn't fixing broken equipment, it was making herself invisible while remaining completely prepared for anything. She had spent decades perfecting the art of being overlooked, of blending into environments where being noticed would mean mission failure or worse, and she had no idea that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to be shattered by someone who remembered when that faded uniform had meant something very different. In places where Elena Kovac had been anything but invisible, the culture at Fort Meridian was like most military installations, hierarchical, traditional, and quick to form judgments based on appearances. For the young soldiers stationed there, fresh from basic training and eager to prove themselves, Elena represented everything they thought they'd moved beyond. She was civilian support staff, someone who existed on the periphery of military life without truly being part of it. "There goes the maintenance lady again," Private Jessica Wells would say whenever Elena passed by the administrative building. Wells was 22, sharp-featured, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd graduated top of her class in military police training. To her, Elena was a curiosity at best, someone playing dress-up in military clothing without earning the right to wear it. The mockery wasn't malicious exactly, but it was constant and pervasive. In the junior enlisted quarters, Elena had become something of a running joke. Soldiers would imitate her quiet manner of speaking, exaggerating her economical movements, and speculating wildly about where she'd gotten her costume. "I bet she orders that stuff from military surplus catalogs," suggested Corporal Brad Hutchinson during one particularly animated discussion in the barracks. "You know those people who collect military gear but never served? My cousin's like that. Has a whole room full of uniforms and equipment. Likes to play soldier on weekends." The assumption stuck because it fit so neatly into their understanding of the world. Here was a middle-aged woman in ill-fitting military clothing, doing maintenance work that anyone could do, speaking only when necessary and keeping to herself. To young soldiers who just earned the right to wear their own uniforms, Elena represented something almost offensive, someone appropriating military identity without paying the price they'd paid. Staff Sergeant Maria Delgado, a logistics coordinator with 6 years of service, was typically more diplomatic, but no less dismissive. "She does good work," Delgado would acknowledge when Elena's name came up in administrative meetings. "Equipment maintenance has improved since she started, but I wish she wouldn't wear that old uniform. It sends the wrong message to the younger soldiers about military standards." The commissioned officers largely ignored Elena altogether. 2. Lieutenant Patricia Summers, the base's assistant operations officer. Elena was simply another contractor whose work was satisfactory but unremarkable. Lieutenant Summers had graduated from West Point with honors and carried herself with the bearing of someone destined for higher command. In her worldview, there were soldiers, officers, and support personnel, and Elena clearly fell into the latter category, but it was the enlisted personnel who made Elena's daily existence most challenging. They were the ones who interacted with her most frequently, calling in work orders, requesting repairs, and observing her as she moved through their spaces. And they were the ones who felt most comfortable expressing their opinions about her appearance and demeanor. "Ma'am, you know you don't have to wear military-style clothing to work here, right?" Specialist Tommy Chun had asked one afternoon while Elena was repairing a malfunctioning printer in the communications office. Chun meant well. He was trying to be helpful, thinking perhaps Elena didn't understand base dress codes. "Civilian contractors usually just wear regular work clothes. Might be more comfortable for you." Elena had simply nodded and continued her work, but Chun's comment sparked a discussion among his colleagues that lasted through the rest of their shift. The consensus was that Elena was probably harmless but misguided, someone who watched too many military movies and wanted to feel like part of something bigger than herself. The dining facility staff treated Elena with polite professionalism tinged with barely concealed amusement. Sergeant Kevin Walsh, who supervised meal service, would always greet her with exaggerated military courtesy. "Good morning, ma'am. What can we serve you today?" The formality was just slightly overdone, carrying the subtle message that he was playing along with. What he saw as her fantasy dot, even the base's civilian employees found Elena's appearance noteworthy. Janet Morrison, who managed the post-exchange, often wondered aloud to her staff about "that woman who dresses like she's in the army." Morrison had worked on military bases for 15 years and had seen plenty of contractor personnel, but none who insisted on wearing military-style clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. The assumptions about Elena's background became increasingly elaborate over time. Some soldiers theorized she was a military widow trying to honor her deceased husband's memory. Others suggested she was someone who'd washed out of basic training but couldn't let go of military aspirations. A few believed she was simply eccentric, one of those people who adopted military aesthetics without understanding their significance. Sergeant First Class David Park, a combat engineer with 3 deployments under his belt, was perhaps the most vocal in his criticism. "It's disrespectful," he would say whenever Elena's name came up. "Those uniforms mean something. People died wearing uniforms like that. She has no right to parade around in military clothing when she's never served a day in her life." Park's perspective carried weight among the enlisted personnel because of his combat experience and leadership position. When he expressed disapproval of Elena's appearance, others felt validated in their own judgments. The consensus became that Elena was, at best, misguided and, at worst, deliberately disrespectful to military traditions. The irony was that Elena's behavior was actually more militarily correct than that of many actual soldiers. She was always punctual, never violated security protocols, maintained her equipment to exceptional standards, and carried herself with the kind of disciplined bearing that military instructors tried to instill in recruits. But because these behaviors came from someone perceived as a civilian playing dress-up, they were either ignored or interpreted as evidence of her obsession with military culture. Young officers fresh from their commissioning courses were perhaps the most condescending in their interactions with Elena. Second Lieutenant Andrew Foster, recently graduated from Officer Candidate School, treated Elena with the kind of patronizing courtesy he might show to a child wearing a police costume. "That's very nice," he said one day when Elena efficiently resolved a complex maintenance issue that had stumped the base's regular repair technicians. "You're quite the little mechanic, aren't you?" The social dynamics were complicated by Elena's obvious competence at her job. Equipment worked better after she serviced it. Problems that had persisted for months were resolved quickly and permanently after Elena's interventions. But instead of earning respect, her technical skills were seen as confirmation that she was overqualified for her position, someone who probably couldn't cut it in whatever field she'd trained for and had settled for maintenance work. The base's senior enlisted personnel maintained professional courtesy but kept their distance. Command Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, a 25-year veteran who'd served in multiple combat zones, treated Elena politely but coolly. In his view, she was effective at her job, but inappropriate in her presentation. He'd seen enough real soldiers to be bothered by someone he perceived as playing soldier. What none of them understood was that their assumptions about Elena said more about their own limitations than about her background. They saw what they expected to see, a civilian contractor in surplus military clothing, doing maintenance work because she couldn't find anything better. They missed the signs that would have been obvious to someone with the right experience and perspective. But Fort Meridian was about to receive a visitor who had exactly that experience and perspective, someone who could read the story written in faded ribbons and weathered fabric, someone who understood that the most dangerous warriors were often the ones who'd learned to hide in plain sight. Elena's days. Fort Meridian followed a pattern so precise it could have been set to a chronometer. Each morning at 0630 hours, her weathered Honda Civic would pull through the main gate, where she'd present her contractor credentials to the guard with a quiet "good morning" that never varied in tone or inflection. The security personnel had long since stopped scrutinizing her identification. After 8 months, Elena Kovac had become as predictable as the sunrise. By 0645, she'd be unlocking the maintenance shed, a low concrete building tucked behind the motor pool that housed the base's repair operations. The shed was her domain, filled with industrial equipment, spare parts organized in military specification storage systems, and workbenches that Elena maintained to standards that exceeded most active duty facilities. The first task was always the same: check the overnight log for emergency repairs, review the day's scheduled maintenance, and prioritize work orders based on operational necessity rather than rank of the requesting officer. Elena's approach, too. Her work revealed habits that seemed excessive for civilian maintenance duties. Every tool had its designated place, marked with precise labels and return to exact positions after use. Her inventory system was more detailed than most military quartermasters maintained, with spreadsheets tracking not just what equipment was available but usage patterns, failure rates, and predictive maintenance schedules that prevented problems before they occurred. The morning routine included a physical inspection of critical systems. That took exactly 47 minutes to complete. Elena would walk a predetermined route through the base, checking generator fuel levels, testing emergency lighting, verifying that communication equipment was operational, and ensuring that security systems were functioning properly. To casual observers, it looked like thoroughness. To anyone trained in operational security, it looked like someone conducting a perimeter assessment. Her movements during these inspections followed patterns that weren't random. Elena never took the same route 2 days in a row, but her variations weren't arbitrary. They ensured she could observe different angles of approach to critical facilities, monitor patterns in personnel movement, and maintain awareness of any changes in base security posture. She moved with the economic efficiency of someone who'd learned to cover ground quickly while remaining inconspicuous. The work orders that came to Elena's desk each day ranged from routine maintenance to complex repairs that had stumped other technicians. Vague systems that had been malfunctioning for weeks would suddenly operate perfectly after Elena's attention. Communications equipment that multiple specialists had declared unrepairable would emerge from her workshop functioning better than when it was new. Electrical systems that had been giving intermittent problems would be resolved with modifications so elegant that other contractors would study Elena's work trying to understand her methods. But it was Elena's approach to these repairs that set her apart from typical maintenance personnel. Before beginning any job, she would spend time studying blueprints and technical manuals with an intensity that seemed excessive for routine repairs. She'd research the operational history of equipment, identify potential failure points, and develop repair strategies that addressed not just immediate problems, but underlying vulnerabilities that might cause future issues. Her tool selection for each job was equally meticulous. Elena carried a personal toolkit that supplemented the standard equipment provided by the base, filled with specialized instruments that most maintenance workers wouldn't recognize, let alone know how to use. Precision measuring devices, electronic testing equipment, and modification tools that suggested someone with advanced technical training in fields far beyond basic repair work. During repairs, Elena worked with a focus and intensity that was almost unsettling to observe. She would become completely absorbed in her tasks, ignoring conversations around her, filtering out distractions, and maintaining concentration that seemed more appropriate for delicate surgical procedures than fixing air conditioners. Her movements were economical and precise, never wasted motion, never hesitation about which tool to use or which approach to take. Lunch breaks were always taken at her desk, usually consisting of simple meals she'd prepared at home. Elena would eat efficiently while reviewing technical documentation, studying equipment manuals, or updating maintenance logs with observations that went far beyond what her contract required. She never joined the informal gatherings in the dining facility, never participated in the casual conversations that helped build relationships among base personnel. Afternoons brought different challenges. While mornings were typically devoted to preventive maintenance and routine inspections, afternoons usually involved responding to equipment failures and emergency repairs. Elena's response time to urgent work orders was remarkable. She could be at any location on the base within minutes of receiving a call, arriving with exactly the tools and materials needed to address the specific problem. Her troubleshooting methods revealed training that went beyond standard technical education. Elena would approach malfunctioning equipment systematically, testing components and sequences that efficiently isolated problems, identifying root causes rather than just addressing symptoms. She had an intuitive understanding of how complex systems interacted, allowing her to predict how repairs in one area might affect operations in another. The paperwork Elena generated was notably different from typical contractor documentation. Her reports were comprehensive, detailed, and organized with military precision. Every repair was documented with before and after photographs, detailed descriptions of problems and solutions, and recommendations for preventing similar issues in the future. The quality of her documentation exceeded most active duty personnel and was beginning to attract attention from base administrators who were impressed by the thoroughness of her record-keeping. Evening procedures followed the same methodical approach as morning routines. Before leaving each day, Elena would secure her workspace, update inventory records, prepare work orders for the following day, and conduct a final inspection of critical systems. Her departure routine included checking that all tools were properly stored, all materials were accounted for, and all security protocols were properly observed. But there were subtle aspects of Elena's routine that revealed something beyond standard maintenance procedures. The way she positioned herself during repairs always provided clear sightlines to potential threats. The tools she selected often had secondary uses that weren't immediately obvious. The modifications she made to equipment sometimes included features that weren't documented in official specifications, but significantly improved operational capability. Her workspace organization reflected habits that seemed excessive for civilian purposes. Emergency supplies were positioned for rapid access. Communication equipment was always functional and tested daily. Backup power sources were maintained at levels that exceeded standard requirements. The arrangement suggested someone who'd learned to prepare for contingencies that normal maintenance workers wouldn't consider. Elena's interactions with base personnel during work calls were professional but minimal. She would listen to problem descriptions, ask precise technical questions, and provide estimated completion times with accuracy that bordered on prescient. But she never engaged in casual conversation, never offered personal opinions about base operations, and never displayed curiosity about activities outside her immediate responsibilities. The patterns Elena had established over 8 months had made her invisible in the way that reliable systems become invisible, always functioning, never failing, providing essential services so consistently that people stopped thinking about how those services were delivered. She had become part of Fort Meridian's infrastructure, as dependable and unremarkable as electrical power or running water. What none of the base personnel realized was that Elena's routine served purposes beyond efficient maintenance operations. Every pattern, every procedure, every methodical approach had been designed to provide comprehensive situational awareness while maintaining perfect operational security. She wasn't just fixing equipment, she was conducting ongoing assessment of base capabilities, vulnerabilities, and readiness. But routines that provided perfect cover could also create perfect exposure when the right observer knew what to look for. The first anomaly occurred during a routine equipment inspection in the armory. Elena had been called to repair a malfunctioning climate control system that was affecting the storage conditions for sensitive weapons. While Sergeant Walsh explained the problem, Elena's eyes swept the room with an intensity that went beyond assessing HVAC requirements. Her gaze lingered on weapon configurations, security protocols, and access points with the kind of professional assessment that armory personnel usually reserved for their own evaluations. "Ma'am, the thermostat is over here," Walsh had said, noting her attention seemed focused elsewhere. But Elena had already identified not just the climate control issue, but 3 potential security vulnerabilities and 2 equipment storage violations that Walsh hadn't noticed. She mentioned none of these observations, simply nodding and beginning her work on the designated repair. The repair itself revealed another contradiction. Elena approached the climate control system with familiarity that suggested prior experience with military-grade environmental controls. She bypassed the standard diagnostic procedures immediately accessing components that most civilian technicians would need technical manuals to locate. Her modifications didn't just fix the immediate problem. They improved the system's efficiency and added redundancy features that exceeded original specifications. During the repair, Alina's positioning was noteworthy. She worked with her back, never fully turned to the weapons storage area, maintained visual contact with all entrances, and positioned her toolkit to provide cover if needed. These weren't conscious decisions. They appeared to be ingrained habits, the kind of automatic behavior that comes from operating in environments where situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. A week later, similar contradictions emerged during the communication system repair in the Base Operations Center. Alina had been requested to address intermittent failures in the radio equipment that coordinated training exercises. While examining the system, she demonstrated knowledge of frequency allocations, encryption protocols, and signal processing. That went far beyond what civilian maintenance personnel typically possessed. "How did you know about the backup frequency array?" asked Specialist Morrison, the communications technician who'd been struggling with the repairs for days. Alina had identified and resolved a complex interference issue by adjusting components that weren't covered in standard technical documentation. Her explanation was brief and technical, but Morrison noticed that Alina's terminology was precise, using military communication standards rather than civilian electrical repair language. The modifications Alina made to the communication system were subtle but significant. She enhanced signal clarity, improved encryption processing, and added filtering capabilities that reduced vulnerability to electronic interference. When Morrison tested the improved system, the performance exceeded manufacturer specifications. But when he asked Alina where she'd learned these advanced techniques, she simply mentioned prior experience with communication systems and changed the subject. During a power grid maintenance call, Alina's response to an electrical emergency revealed training that seemed inconsistent with civilian contractor background. A transformer failure had created a potentially dangerous situation, with live wires threatening both personnel and equipment. While base electricians were debating the safest approach to isolating the problem, Alina had already begun implementing emergency procedures with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with similar crises under more challenging conditions. Her approach to the electrical emergency was methodical and efficient. Alina shut down power systems in a sequence that prevented cascade failures, isolated dangerous components using techniques that minimized exposure time, and restored service through backup systems that some base personnel didn't even know existed. Throughout the crisis, she remained calm and focused, coordinating with other technicians using clear, concise instructions that suggested experience in high-pressure situations. The tools Alina used during the electrical repair included specialized equipment that wasn't part of standard contractor supplies, multi-spectrum testing devices, precision measurement instruments, and safety equipment that exceeded normal civilian standards. When questioned about the advanced tools, Alina explained they were personal equipment she'd acquired for complex repairs, but her explanations were vague about where such equipment might be obtained or why a maintenance contractor would need such sophisticated instruments. A particularly revealing incident occurred during the scheduled maintenance call in the base's secure communications facility. Alina had been cleared for routine equipment servicing, but her behavior in the classified environment revealed familiarity with security protocols that civilian contractors typically wouldn't possess. She instinctively avoided positioning herself near sensitive equipment displays, maintained appropriate distances from classified materials, and demonstrated awareness of compartmentalization procedures without being briefed on facility-specific requirements. While working in the secure facility, Alina's movements followed patterns consistent with someone trained in operational security. She worked efficiently to minimize time in classified areas, avoided unnecessary exposure to sensitive information, and maintained professional focus that prevented casual observation of classified activities. Her behavior was more appropriate. For someone with security clearance and classified access experience than for a civilian contractor performing routine maintenance. The repair work Elena performed in the secure facility was notable for its sophistication. She resolved complex integration issues between classified and unclassified systems, improved operational efficiency without compromising security protocols, and enhanced system reliability, using modifications that required understanding of both technical specifications and security requirements. Her solutions reflected knowledge of how secure communication systems operated in operational environments rather than just technical familiarity with individual components. Personnel who worked with Elena during these various repairs began noticing patterns that didn't fit their assumptions about her background. Her technical knowledge was too comprehensive, her security awareness too sophisticated, and her problem-solving approaches too advanced for someone with purely civilian maintenance experience. But these observations remained individual impressions rather than collective recognition that something was unusual about Elena's qualifications. Another contradiction emerged during a vehicle maintenance call at the motor pool. Elena had been requested to diagnose electrical problems in a convoy truck that had been experiencing intermittent failures during field exercises. While examining the vehicle, Elena demonstrated knowledge of military vehicle specifications, operational requirements, and maintenance procedures that exceeded civilian automotive experience. Her diagnostic approach revealed familiarity with how military vehicles operated under field conditions rather than just garage-based maintenance. Elena identified problems related to dust infiltration, vibration stress, and operational abuse that civilian mechanics might not consider. Her repairs addressed not just immediate electrical issues, but underlying vulnerabilities that could cause failures during deployment conditions. The modifications Elena made to the convoy truck were subtle but significant. She improved electrical connections to handle operational stress, enhanced filtration systems to reduce environmental damage, and added diagnostic capabilities that would help operators identify problems before they caused mission failures. Her work reflected understanding of how vehicles performed in operational environments, rather than just technical knowledge of automotive systems. During a water treatment facility repair, Elena's knowledge of chemical processing, filtration systems, and water quality standards suggested experience beyond routine maintenance work. She resolved complex contamination issues, improved system efficiency, and enhanced monitoring capabilities using approaches that required understanding of both technical specifications and operational requirements for military water supplies. These accumulated observations created a pattern of contradictions that defied easy explanation. Elena's technical capabilities were too advanced, her security awareness too sophisticated, and her operational knowledge too comprehensive for someone with the background her personnel file suggested. But the contradictions were subtle enough that individual observations could be explained away as coincidence or exceptional civilian experience. What none of the observers realized was that Elena's greatest skill wasn't technical expertise. It was the ability to demonstrate just enough capability to complete assigned tasks, while concealing the full extent of her knowledge and experience. Every repair was carefully calibrated to resolve problems efficiently, without revealing competencies that would raise questions about her background. But as Elena continued working at Fort Meridian, the accumulated weight of these subtle contradictions was creating a foundation for recognition by someone with the right experience and perspective to understand what the pattern meant. Colonel Harrison Vance had spent 32 years in the military developing an eye for details that others missed. It was a skill that had kept him alive through multiple deployments and helped him identify threats that standard intelligence often overlooked. So when the small woman in the faded uniform walked past his office window for the third time that week, Following a route that provided optimal observation of base security procedures, Vance began paying attention. The first thing that caught his notice wasn't Elena's appearance, it was her movement patterns. Vance had learned to read body language the way others read newspapers, and Elena's posture told a story that didn't match her contractor credentials. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who'd been trained to navigate hostile environments, maintaining situational awareness that went far beyond civilian security consciousness. From his office on the second floor of the administration building, Vance had an excellent view of the maintenance areas where Elena worked. He began observing her routine with the analytical attention he'd once used to study enemy positions. What he saw troubled him in ways he couldn't initially articulate. Elena's behavior patterns were too sophisticated, her operational awareness too comprehensive for someone with purely civilian background. The morning Vance witnessed Elena's response to a medical emergency convinced him that his suspicions warranted serious investigation. A young soldier had collapsed during PT formation, apparently suffering from heat exhaustion complicated by an undiagnosed medical condition. While medics were being summoned, Elena had appeared with medical supplies and begun providing emergency care with competence that exceeded most combat lifesavers. Vance watched through binoculars as Elena assessed the soldier's condition using diagnostic procedures that weren't taught in civilian first aid courses. She checked vital signs with practiced efficiency, administered emergency treatment using techniques that suggested advanced medical training, and coordinated with arriving medics using military medical terminology that civilian contractors wouldn't typically know. What impressed Vance most wasn't Elena's medical competence, it was her approach to the emergency situation. She had positioned herself to maintain visual contact with potential threats while providing medical care, coordinated her actions with security personnel without being asked, and managed the crisis with calm professionalism that suggested experience. In high-stress operational environments. After the medical emergency, Vance began systematically observing Elena's interactions with base personnel. He noticed that she instinctively adapted her communication style based on the rank and experience level of whoever she was addressing. With junior enlisted personnel, she used simple, direct language. With senior NCOs, she employed military terminology and professional courtesy that suggested familiarity with military hierarchy. With officers, her demeanor conveyed respectful competence without the uncertainty that civilian contractors often displayed in military environments. Vance's most significant observation came during a routine security drill that Elena happened to witness. While most civilian personnel either ignored the exercise or watched with curious detachment, Elena had positioned herself to observe the drill with professional interest. Vance watched through his office window as Elena mentally tracked the movement of security teams, noted response times, and assessed the effectiveness of security procedures with the analytical attention of someone evaluating operational readiness. During the security drill, Elena's positioning was tactically sound. She had chosen an observation point that provided comprehensive situational awareness while maintaining appropriate distance from sensitive activities. Her attention focused on elements that indicated professional understanding of security operations, response coordination, communication procedures, equipment effectiveness, and personnel training levels. After the drill concluded, Vance noticed Elena making brief notes in a small notebook. While this could have been routine maintenance documentation, the timing and Elena's focused attention during the security exercise suggested she was recording observations that went beyond equipment repair requirements. Vance made a mental note to investigate what kind of documentation Elena was maintaining. The following week, Vance arranged to personally observe Elena during a complex repair operation in the base communications center. He positioned himself where he could watch her work without being obvious about his surveillance. What he observed confirmed his growing suspicions about Elena's background and Qualifications. Elena approached the communication system repair with expertise that exceeded most military communication specialists. She demonstrated familiarity with classified communication protocols, understood the operational requirements of secure military communications, and resolved technical problems using solutions that required comprehensive understanding of military communication systems and procedures. During the repair operation, Vance noticed Elena's unconscious habits revealed training that civilian contractors wouldn't possess. She automatically positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all entrances, worked with one ear constantly monitoring radio communications, and handled classified equipment with security awareness that suggested experience with compartmentalized operations. Vance's investigation of Elena's personnel file revealed inconsistencies that reinforced his suspicions. Her listed employment history included gaps that weren't adequately explained, professional references that were vague about specific job responsibilities, and technical qualifications that seemed incomplete given her demonstrated competence. The file contained enough information to satisfy administrative requirements, but lacked the detail that would normally accompany someone with Elena's evident expertise. Most troubling, too, Vance was Elena's security clearance documentation. While her contractor status required basic clearance for access to certain base facilities, the processing records showed unusual handling that suggested prior clearance history that wasn't reflected in current documentation. The clearance had been approved through channels that typically handled special cases, rather than routine contractor applications. Vance's background in military intelligence had taught him to recognize when official records didn't tell complete stories. Elena's personnel file contained all the required documentation, but felt sanitized, as if information had been deliberately omitted or obscured. The overall impression was of someone whose real background was being concealed behind a carefully constructed civilian identity. A conversation with the base security officer provided additional concerning information. Captain Rebecca Stone, who managed contractor clearances and access control, mentioned that Elena's clearance application had been processed through unusual channels with expedited approval that bypassed normal investigative procedures. While the clearance was legitimate, the processing had been handled at higher levels than typically required for maintenance. Contractor positions. Stone also mentioned that Elena's behavior during security briefings had been noteworthy. While most civilian contractors required detailed explanation of base security procedures, Elena had demonstrated immediate understanding of complex security protocols and had asked questions that suggested familiarity with operational security requirements that weren't normally covered in contractor briefings. Vance's most revealing observation came during an unscheduled visit to Elena's workspace. He had arrived at the maintenance shed ostensibly to discuss repair schedules, but actually to observe Elena's work environment and organizational methods. What he found was a workspace organized to military standards that exceeded most active duty facilities. Elena's tool organization, inventory management, and documentation systems reflected training and habits that weren't developed through civilian maintenance experience. Her workspace was configured for rapid response to emergency situations, maintained supply levels that suggested understanding of operational logistics, and included communication equipment that exceeded standard contractor requirements. During their brief conversation about repair schedules, Vance tested Elena's knowledge by referencing military terminology and operational concepts that civilian contractors wouldn't normally understand. Elena's responses revealed familiarity with military operations, organizational structures, and procedural requirements that confirmed Vance's suspicions about her background. After leaving Elena's workspace, Vance was convinced that Elena Kovac wasn't the civilian maintenance contractor her personnel file claimed she was. Her competence was too comprehensive, her operational awareness too sophisticated, and her organizational methods too advanced for someone with purely civilian background. But without additional evidence, Vance couldn't determine who Elena really was or why she was concealing her true identity. Vance began developing a plan to investigate Elena's background more thoroughly. He would need to use contacts and resources that went beyond normal administrative channels. But his 32 years of military service had taught him that some questions were important enough to justify extraordinary measures. Elena's presence at Fort Meridian was either a remarkable coincidence or something that required immediate investigation. What Vance didn't realize was that his careful observation of Elena hadn't gone unnoticed. Someone with Elena's training and experience could detect surveillance as easily as Vance could identify inconsistencies in personnel files. The game of observation was about to become more complex than either of them anticipated. Colonel Vance's investigation began with the kind of methodical approach that had served him well during intelligence operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. He started by making discreet inquiries through official channels, contacting personnel offices and contractor management companies to verify Elena's employment history and background documentation. The responses he received were technically correct but felt incomplete, like reading a story with crucial chapters missing. The contractor management firm that employed Elena provided standard verification of her current assignment but claimed limited access to detailed employment records. When Vance pressed for more comprehensive background information, he was told that Elena's file had been processed through special arrangements that restricted access to certain historical data. The explanation was plausible but unsatisfying. It answered his questions while raising new ones about why a maintenance contractor would require special handling. Vance's next step was to utilize his network of military contacts to investigate Elena's background through unofficial channels. He reached out to colleagues in personnel management, military intelligence, and contractor oversight, hoping someone might have additional information about Elena's history or the circumstances of her current assignment. The responses were uniformly unhelpful, but in ways that suggested deliberate information restriction rather than simple lack of records. A conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Janet Pierce, who managed contractor operations at the Pentagon, provided the first significant lead in Vance's investigation. Pierce mentioned that Elena's contractor assignment had been arranged through special procedures that bypassed normal procurement processes. While the arrangement was legitimate, it had been handled at classification levels that Pierce wasn't authorized to access. The unusual processing suggested that Elena's assignment served purposes beyond routine maintenance support. Pierce also mentioned that inquiries about Elena's background had been redirected to offices that specialized in personnel with classified operational histories. While Pierce couldn't provide specific information, she suggested that Vance's questions about Elena might be better addressed through intelligence channels rather than standard personnel management. The implication was clear. Elena's real background was classified at levels that normal administrative procedures couldn't access. Encouraged by this lead, Vance contacted Major General William Crawford, his former commanding officer who now worked in the Pentagon Special Operations Oversight Division. Crawford's response was immediate and concerning. After Vance described Elena and her unusual competencies, Crawford requested a secure phone conversation that revealed disturbing implications about Elena's presence at Fort Meridian. During their classified discussion, Crawford confirmed that someone matching Elena's description had been the subject of previous military intelligence interest. While he couldn't provide specific details over unsecured communications, Crawford indicated that Elena's background involved special operations assignments that remained classified at the highest levels. More troubling, Crawford mentioned that Elena's current civilian status raised questions about whether her presence at Fort Meridian was coincidental or represented a security concern that required immediate investigation. Crawford arranged for Vance to receive classified briefing materials through secure channels that would provide background information necessary for proper assessment of Elena's situation. The materials would take several days to arrive through secure courier services, but Crawford emphasized the importance of maintaining operational security during the investigation. If Elena was indeed who Crawford suspected, premature exposure could compromise ongoing classified operations or create security vulnerabilities that extended far beyond Fort Meridian. While waiting for the classified materials, Vance began conducting physical surveillance of Elena's activities to gather additional intelligence about her capabilities and potential objectives. He arranged his schedule to provide opportunities for direct observation while maintaining plausible cover for his presence in areas where Elena worked. The surveillance revealed behavior patterns that confirmed his suspicions about Elena's professional background. During the complex repair operation in the base's Emergency Operations Center, Vance observed Elena's response to classified information that was inadvertently exposed during the repair process. Instead of showing curiosity or attempting to observe classified materials, Elena demonstrated practiced avoidance techniques that suggested training in compartmentalized security procedures. Her behavior was consistent with someone who understood the serious consequences of unauthorized access to classified information. Vance also noticed Elena's unconscious tactical awareness during routine activities. While working in various locations around the base, Elena consistently positioned herself to maintain visual contact with potential threats, selected routes that provided optimal escape options, and demonstrated situational awareness that exceeded security consciousness typically displayed by civilian personnel. Her behavior suggested ongoing operational readiness rather than civilian contractor routine. The surveillance revealed that Elena's toolkit included equipment that went beyond standard maintenance requirements. Vance observed specialized communication devices, electronic testing equipment, and precision instruments that suggested capabilities extending beyond routine repair work. While the equipment could have legitimate maintenance applications, the sophistication and military specifications suggested access to resources not normally available to civilian contractors. Vance's investigation expanded to include Elena's off-base activities and personal life. Discreet inquiries revealed that Elena lived in a modest apartment complex popular with military retirees and contractor personnel. Her neighbors described her as quiet, polite, and unremarkable, someone who kept regular hours, maintained her property meticulously, and avoided social interactions that might reveal personal information. A conversation with Elena's apartment complex manager provided additional insights into her character and habits. The manager mentioned that Elena had paid a full year's rent in advance, had requested specific security features for her unit, and had demonstrated knowledge of building security systems that exceeded normal tenant interest. Elena's lease application had been processed through a property management company that specialized in housing for personnel with security clearances. Vance's investigation of Elena's financial records, conducted through official channels available to base security officers, revealed a pattern consistent with someone receiving income from sources beyond her stated contractor employment. While her contractor salary was adequate for basic living expenses, Elena's spending patterns suggested access to additional resources that weren't reflected in visible income sources. The financial profile was consistent with someone receiving classified compensation or maintaining resources from previous specialized employment. The most significant breakthrough in Vance's investigation came through an unexpected source. Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, the base's senior enlisted advisor, approached Vance with concerns about Elena that had been developing over several months. Hayes had noticed Elena's advanced capabilities during various interactions and had begun wondering whether her presence at Fort Meridian might be connected to ongoing security assessments or classified operations. Hayes mentioned that Elena's behavior during security incidents had been consistently professional and appropriate, but revealed training and experience that seemed inconsistent with civilian contractor background. During a recent base lockdown exercise, Elena had automatically implemented security procedures that weren't covered in contractor briefings, suggesting familiarity with classified emergency protocols that civilian personnel shouldn't possess. More importantly, Hayes revealed that Elena had been asking subtle questions about base operations, personnel assignments, and training schedules that could be interpreted as either professional interest in maintenance coordination or intelligence gathering for purposes that weren't immediately apparent. While Elena's questions were always appropriate and job-related, the pattern suggested systematic information collection that went beyond routine. Maintenance requirements. The conversation with Hayes convinced Vance that his investigation needed to accelerate. If Elena was conducting intelligence collection at Fort Meridian, whether for legitimate or illegitimate purposes, the security implications required immediate clarification. Vance decided to arrange a direct confrontation with Elena that would either confirm her legitimate status or expose any deception about her background and objectives. Vance's plan was to engineer a situation that would test Elena's reactions to security challenges that would reveal her true capabilities and training. He would create a scenario that required Elena to choose between maintaining her civilian contractor cover or responding with the competence that her real background would provide. The test would be designed to appear routine while actually providing definitive evidence about Elena's true identity and qualifications. But as Vance finalized his plans for confronting Elena, he received the classified briefing materials that Crowford had promised. The information contained in those documents would change everything. Vance thought he knew about Elena Kovac and the reasons for her presence at Fort Meridian. The moment of truth came during what should have been a routine equipment inspection in the base armory. Colonel Vance had arranged for Elena to be called in to address a malfunctioning security system that protected the facility's most sensitive weapons storage area. What Elena didn't know was that Vance had deliberately created a scenario that would require her to choose between maintaining her cover and responding with the expertise her real background would provide. The security system failure was more complex than Elena had been told. Multiple redundant systems had failed simultaneously, creating a situation that posed genuine risk to base security. As Elena examined the malfunctioning equipment, it became clear that resolving the problem would require knowledge of classified security protocols and advanced technical skills that no civilian contractor should possess. Vance watched from the observation room as Elena stood before the complex array of security monitors, access control systems, and intrusion detection equipment. For several minutes, she maintained her civilian contractor persona, limiting her examination to components that would be accessible to someone with basic maintenance clearance. But as the severity of the security vulnerability became apparent, Elena's professional instincts began to override her cover identity. The breakthrough moment came when Elena noticed something that the base security personnel had missed. The system failures weren't random malfunctions. They followed a pattern that suggested deliberate sabotage designed to create specific vulnerabilities in the armory's protection systems. Elena's recognition of the sabotage pattern revealed analytical capabilities that went far beyond civilian maintenance expertise. Without thinking, Elena began implementing countermeasures that demonstrated intimate knowledge of military security systems. She bypassed damaged components using procedures that weren't documented in civilian technical manuals, activated backup systems that most base personnel didn't know existed, and restored security coverage using techniques that required classified knowledge of the facility's protection protocols. Vance realized he was witnessing someone who had clearly designed and implemented similar security systems in operational environments. Elena's responses weren't those of someone learning to work with unfamiliar equipment. They were the practiced movements of someone who had installed, maintained, and defended such systems under hostile conditions. The revelation accelerated when Elena discovered physical evidence of the sabotage attempt. Hidden among the damaged components was a sophisticated, electronic device designed to create systematic failures while avoiding detection. Elena's immediate recognition of the device and her knowledge of appropriate countermeasures revealed experience with adversarial operations that civilian contractors would never encounter. As Elena worked to neutralize the sabotage device, her movements became more fluid and confident. The careful restraint she had maintained for months began to slip away, replaced by the efficient professionalism of someone working in their actual area of expertise. She handled the dangerous device with practiced competence, using techniques that required specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal and electronic warfare countermeasures. Colonel Vance could no longer maintain his position as a passive observer. The security threat was real. Elena was clearly qualified to address it, and maintaining the pretense of her civilian status was becoming counterproductive to base security. He entered the armory and approached Elena directly, abandoning the careful surveillance that had characterized his investigation. "Ms. Kovac," Vance said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had decided to stop playing games. "I think it's time we discussed your actual qualifications for this kind of work." Elena looked up from the sabotage device, her hands still working to disable the threat, but her eyes now showing the alertness of someone whose cover had been compromised. For a moment, the carefully maintained facade of the quiet maintenance contractor flickered, revealing something harder and more dangerous underneath. "Colonel," Elena replied, her voice still steady but carrying a different quality than the deferential tone she had maintained for 8 months. "I'm just trying to restore your security systems to operational status." But even as she spoke, Elena was making rapid tactical assessments. Her positioning shifted subtly to provide better defensive options. Her awareness expanded to include all potential threats in the immediate area, and her body language reflected the readiness of someone prepared for the situation to escalate rapidly. Vance noticed the transformation immediately. This wasn't the uncertain civilian contractor who had been deferential to military authority for months. This was someone comfortable with command responsibilities, tactical decision-making, and high-stakes operational environments. The change was so complete that Vance wondered how he had ever believed Elena's civilian contractor persona. "The device you're working with," Vance continued, "requires specialized knowledge to disable safely. Knowledge that civilian maintenance contractors don't typically possess." Elena's hands continued working on the sabotage device, but her responses became more guarded. "I've had experience with security systems, Colonel. Sometimes that experience is more comprehensive than personnel files might indicate." The admission was subtle but significant. Elena was acknowledging specialized capabilities while still maintaining plausible deniability about the extent of her background. But her technical work was providing more definitive evidence than any verbal admission could offer. As Elena completed the device neutralization, Vance observed techniques that confirmed his suspicions about her background. She handled the device with the confidence of someone who had dealt with improvised explosive devices in operational environments, used electronic countermeasures that required advanced training in electronic warfare, and implemented security protocols that were classified at levels requiring special operations clearance. The final confirmation came when Elena turned to address the broader security vulnerability that the sabotage had exposed. Without consulting technical manuals or seeking guidance from base security personnel, she began implementing comprehensive countermeasures that revealed intimate knowledge of military security doctrine, threat assessment procedures, and defensive system integration. "Colonel," Elena said, her voice now carrying the professional tone of someone briefing a superior officer rather than a contractor reporting to a client. "This sabotage attempt was designed to create specific vulnerabilities that would support a more sophisticated attack on this facility. The device I just neutralized was only the first phase of a multi-stage operation. Vance realized that Elena's warning came with authority that couldn't be dismissed. Her analysis of the threat was too comprehensive, her understanding of adversarial tactics too sophisticated, and her recommended countermeasures too advanced for someone without extensive experience in defensive operations. What kind of experience qualifies you to make that assessment? Vance asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elena hesitated for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her toolkit and withdrew a small electronic device that Vance recognized immediately. It was a military communication unit configured for encrypted contact with classified operational networks. Civilian contractors didn't have access to such equipment. Using the communication device, Elena initiated contact with what was clearly a classified command structure. Her conversation was brief and coded, but Vance understood enough to realize that Elena was reporting a security incident through channels that required clearances far beyond anything maintenance contractors should possess after completing her communication. Elena turned to face Vance directly. The transformation was complete. Gone was any pretense of civilian contractor deference. Standing before him was someone comfortable with command authority and operational responsibility. "Colonel Vance," Elena said, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone revealing their true identity. "I believe it's time for a more comprehensive discussion about why I'm really here at Fort Meridian." But before Vance could respond, Elena did something that made his blood run cold. She reached inside her faded jacket and withdrew a small leather folder that contained military identification and credentials. When she opened the folder, Vance saw official documentation that proved Elena Kovac wasn't just a former military personnel. She was still active duty, operating under deep cover assignment that had required her to maintain civilian contractor status for operational purposes. The identification revealed Elena's actual rank and assignment to a classified unit that Vance recognized from his intelligence background. She wasn't just former special operations. She was currently assigned to a unit that handled the most sensitive security operations in the military. Her presence at Fort Meridian wasn't coincidental. It was part of an ongoing classified investigation that had just uncovered a genuine security threat. Colonel Vance realized that his investigation of Elena had inadvertently interfered with a classified operation that was far more important than he had imagined. Major Elena Kovac, as Vance now knew her true rank, had spent 15 years in military service that officially didn't exist. Her career had begun conventionally enough, enlisted at 18, excelled in basic training, and earned selection for advanced technical schools that led to specialization in electronic warfare and communications systems. But it was her performance during a classified incident in her third year of service that changed the trajectory of her military career forever. The incident occurred during a joint training exercise in Nevada when a simulation had gone catastrophically wrong, resulting in actual casualties and a security breach that threatened to expose classified capabilities to foreign intelligence services. While senior personnel struggled to contain the situation, Elena had demonstrated initiative and competence that saved lives and prevented a major intelligence compromise. Her actions brought her to the attention of recruiters from the Army's most classified Special Operations Unit, the unit that recruited. Elena operated under designation Night Watch, a compartmentalized organization that handled security threats, requiring technical expertise combined with operational capability. Unlike traditional special forces that focused on direct action or reconnaissance, Night Watch specialists were trained to operate in civilian environments, where their military status had to remain completely concealed while they addressed threats to national security that conventional forces couldn't handle. Elena's training for Night Watch operations had lasted 2 years and transformed her from a skilled technical specialist into something approaching a one-person intelligence and security operation. She learned advanced electronic warfare, counterintelligence procedures, deep cover identity construction, and operational planning for missions that required her to work alone in environments where discovery would mean mission failure and potential loss of life. Her first assignment had been to investigate security vulnerabilities at defense contractors, whose work supported classified programs. Operating under civilian cover identities, Elena spent months at various companies, identifying weaknesses in their security procedures and neutralizing threats from foreign intelligence services trying to steal sensitive technologies. The work required her to maintain perfect civilian personas while conducting sophisticated intelligence operations. Over the course of 8 years, Elena had completed 17 different cover assignments, each requiring her to assume a different civilian identity while investigating security threats that ranged from industrial espionage to terrorist infiltration of sensitive facilities. She had worked as everything from a factory supervisor to a university researcher, always maintaining deep cover while identifying and neutralizing threats that could have compromised national security. The psychological toll of maintaining false identities for extended periods had been severe. Elena had lived so many different lives that sometimes she struggled to remember which aspects of her personality were genuine and which were constructed for operational purposes. The isolation was complete. She couldn't maintain personal relationships, couldn't have a permanent home, and couldn't share her experiences with anyone who wasn't cleared for her operational activities. Her assignment to Fort Meridian represented her 18th cover operation, but this one was different in ways that made it particularly challenging. Instead of investigating external threats to the base, Elena was there to assess whether security vulnerabilities existed within the base's own personnel and procedures. The investigation had been prompted by intelligence suggesting that classified information was being systematically compromised through sources that hadn't been identified through conventional counterintelligence methods. Elena's cover as a maintenance contractor provided access to virtually every facility on the base while requiring minimal interaction with personnel who might recognize inconsistencies in her background. The maintenance role allowed her to observe security procedures, assess personnel reliability, and identify potential vulnerabilities, while maintaining a perfectly plausible explanation for her presence in sensitive areas. The faded uniform that had generated so much mockery from base personnel was actually a carefully constructed element of her cover identity. The uniform belonged to Lana's real military service, but she had deliberately aged and worn it to create the impression of someone clinging to past military connection rather than someone currently serving in classified capacity. The visible wear patterns and faded insignia told a story of civilian nostalgia rather than active duty service, but maintaining the maintenance contractor cover had required Elena to suppress professional instincts that had been developed through years of operational experience. Every day, she observed security vulnerabilities that she could have corrected, personnel practices that compromised operational security, and equipment configurations that created unnecessary risks. The discipline required to remain passive while observing these problems had been one of the most challenging aspects of her assignment. The medals hidden beneath Elena's jacket represented a career of service that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Campaign ribbons from operations that officially never happened, commendation medals for achievements that remained classified, and unit designations that didn't appear in any public military records. Each ribbon represented missions where Elena's technical expertise and operational capability had been essential to preventing security compromises that could have had national-level consequences. Elena's investigation at Fort Meridian had been progressing systematically until the sabotage incident that forced her to break cover. Over 8 months, she had identified several concerning patterns in base security that suggested systematic intelligence collection by hostile actors, personnel with unexplained financial resources, communication patterns that suggested coordination with external parties, and equipment modifications that could facilitate information, EXFILTION, that the sabotage device that Alina had just neutralized represented confirmation of her worst suspicions about Fort Meridian's security situation. The sophistication of the device, its placement within the Armory's security systems, and its programming to create specific vulnerabilities indicated that hostile intelligence services had achieved penetration of the base that was far more serious than anyone had suspected. Alina's analysis of the sabotage device revealed that it was part of a coordinated operation designed to gather intelligence about the base's defensive capabilities while creating opportunities for more aggressive action against sensitive facilities. The device had been programmed to transmit data about security procedures, personnel schedules, and equipment configurations to external receivers that Alina suspected were operated by foreign intelligence services. More concerning was Alina's assessment that the sabotage device had been installed by someone with legitimate access to the Armory and detailed knowledge of its security systems. The placement and configuration required insider knowledge that suggested the hostile operation had successfully recruited or compromised base personnel. Alina's investigation would now need to expand to identify which personnel had been compromised and how extensively the hostile operation had penetrated Fort Meridian security. The decision to reveal her true identity to Colonel Vance had been prompted by Alina's assessment that the security threat had escalated beyond what she could address while maintaining her cover. The sabotage device represented immediate danger to base security that required coordinated response from base leadership. Alina could no longer afford to work alone when the threat had proven to be more sophisticated and immediate than her original intelligence had suggested. Alina's communication with her classified command structure had been to report that her cover operation had been compromised by operational necessity and to request authorization for expanded investigation using resources. That would require revealing her true status to base leadership. The response had authorized Alina to coordinate with Colonel Vance and other senior base personnel to address the immediate security threat while maintaining operational security for ongoing aspects of her investigation. The revelation of Alina's true identity created immediate complications for both her mission and base security. Personnel who had been observing Alina as a civilian contractor would now need to be briefed on her actual status and mission, creating additional security risks. The hostile operation that had placed the sabotage device would likely recognize that their penetration had been discovered and might accelerate their activities or attempt to eliminate the threat that Alina represented. Most significantly, Alina's investigation had revealed that Fort Meridian was facing a security threat that was more serious and immediate than anyone had suspected. The base's defenses had been systematically compromised by hostile intelligence services that had achieved penetration deep enough to place sophisticated sabotage devices in the most sensitive facilities. Alina's mission was no longer just investigation. It had become active defense against an ongoing attack on national security infrastructure. The revelation of Alina's true identity sent shockwaves through Fort Meridian that reverberated far beyond the Armory where her cover had been blown. Within hours of Colonel Vance's emergency briefing to base command, the entire command structure was grappling with the implications of having an undercover special operations officer working among them for 8 months without their knowledge. General Patricia Blackwater, the base commander, convened an immediate classified briefing that included only the most senior personnel with appropriate security clearances. The initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by professional embarrassment that none of them had recognized Alina's true capabilities despite months of interaction. The general's first question was pointed and uncomfortable. How did we miss obvious signs that she wasn't a civilian contractor? Staff officers who had worked with Alina found themselves reassessing every interaction, every work order, every casual conversation in light of her revealed identity. Captain Stone, the base security officer, was particularly shaken by the realization that Elena had been conducting security assessments of her own procedures while maintaining perfect operational security. She observed our security briefings, our clearance procedures, our access controls, and none of us suspected she was evaluating our effectiveness. The junior enlisted personnel who had mocked Elena's appearance and competence experienced a more personal form of professional humiliation. Private Thompson, who had been most vocal in his ridicule of Elena's costume, found himself reviewing every interaction with growing mortification. She was listening to us joke about her uniform while she was actually investigating security threats that could have gotten us all killed. He confided to his barracks mates. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had condescendingly suggested Elena might be in the wrong facility, was now required to brief his personnel on how their behavior toward Elena had potentially compromised base security. Our assumptions about civilian contractors created blind spots in our own security awareness, Rodriguez explained to his squad. We need to reassess how we evaluate personnel who don't fit our expectations. The dining facility staff who had treated Elena with barely concealed amusement now understood that their helpful suggestions about appropriate dress codes had been directed at someone whose military credentials exceeded their own. Sergeant Walsh found himself wondering what Elena had thought of their patronizing courtesy and whether their behavior had affected her ability to complete her mission effectively. Lieutenant Patricia Summers, who had largely ignored Elena as unremarkable support personnel, was forced to confront how her dismissive attitude had revealed limitations in her own professional judgment. During the classified briefing about Elena's true status, Summers realized that her West Point training had prepared her to recognize leadership and competence in conventional military contexts, but had failed to help her identify exceptional capability when it was deliberately concealed. The technical staff who had worked with Elena on various repair projects experienced a different kind of professional revelation. They began analyzing Elena's work with new understanding, recognizing that her seemingly intuitive solutions to complex problems had actually been the result of advanced training and extensive experience. Specialist Morrison, who had been impressed by Elena's communication system modifications, now understood that Elena's improvements had been based on operational knowledge gained through classified missions. Sergeant First Class Park, who had been most vocal about Elena's alleged disrespect for military tradition, found his criticism reversed in the most uncomfortable way possible. Instead of someone inappropriately wearing military clothing, Elena was revealed to be someone whose actual service record exceeded most personnel on the base. Park's complaints about Elena's appearance now seemed petty and ignorant, reflecting his own limited understanding of how classified operations required personnel to maintain civilian cover. The base's civilian employees experienced their own form of revelation about Elena's true identity. Janet Morrison, who managed the post exchange, realized that her speculation about Elena's background had been completely wrong. Instead of someone playing military dress-up, Elena had been someone whose real military service was so classified that maintaining a civilian cover identity was essential to her mission success. Medical personnel who had witnessed Elena's competent response to the training emergency now understood that her advanced medical skills weren't the result of exceptional civilian first aid training, but rather specialized combat medical training that was part of her special operations background. The base medics realized they had been working alongside someone whose medical expertise in high-stress situations exceeded their own institutional training. The maintenance staff who worked most closely with Elena faced the most complex professional adjustments. They had to reconcile their perception of Elena as a competent but unremarkable contractor with the reality that she was a special operations officer whose technical skills were the result of years of classified training. Elena's equipment modifications and repair techniques now appeared in a completely different context. Not lucky intuition, but professional expertise applied with deliberate restraint. Command Sergeant Major Hayes, who had noticed inconsistencies in Elena's behavior, felt vindicated in his suspicions, but also concerned about the implications of Elena's investigation. If Night Watch had assigned someone of Elena's caliber to investigate Fort Meridian, the security threats they suspected were more serious than normal counterintelligence procedures could address. Hayes realized that Elena's presence indicated Fort Meridian was facing threats that required the most advanced defensive capabilities the military possessed. The revelation created immediate operational changes in how base personnel interacted with civilian contractors and support staff. Security briefings were modified to emphasize that personnel should not make assumptions about contractor capabilities or backgrounds. The incident with Elena demonstrated that apparent civilian status might conceal military personnel operating under deep cover for legitimate security purposes. More significantly, Elena's investigation results forced a comprehensive reassessment of Fort Meridian's security posture. The sabotage device she had neutralized was only the most visible evidence of hostile intelligence penetration that appeared to be far more extensive than anyone had suspected. Base security procedures that had seemed adequate were now recognized as vulnerable to sophisticated adversaries who had successfully placed assets within the installation. The personnel who had been dismissive of Elena now found themselves included in expanded security investigations to determine whether their behavior had been influenced by hostile intelligence services or whether they had been unknowingly manipulated to create security vulnerabilities. The investigation revealed that some of the mockery directed at Elena had been encouraged by personnel who were now suspected of working for foreign intelligence services. Elena's revealed competence also created new opportunities for base operations. Her technical expertise and operational experience were now available to address security challenges that had previously seemed intractable. Equipment that had been experiencing persistent problems was quickly resolved when Elena could apply her full capabilities without maintaining her civilian contractor limitations. The psychological impact on base personnel was equally significant. Many soldiers realized they had witnessed exceptional professional competence while dismissing it as civilian incompetence. The experience forced them to question their own judgment and recognize that their assumptions about military bearing and civilian capability had created dangerous blind spots in their situational awareness. Most importantly, Elena's revelation changed how base personnel understood the nature of military service in the modern security environment. Traditional concepts of uniform appearance and conventional military bearing were inadequate for recognizing personnel who served in classified capacities that required them to operate under civilian cover. The incident with Elena demonstrated that the most capable military personnel might be the ones whose service was so classified that it had to remain invisible to protect operational security. The security operation that followed Elena's revelation moved with the swift precision of a military unit that had discovered an active threat in their midst. Within 48 hours of her identity being exposed, Fort Meridian had been locked down under security protocols that most personnel had never seen implemented. Elena worked openly now, her civilian contractor persona abandoned in favor of coordinating the most comprehensive counterintelligence operation the base had ever experienced. Elena's expertise proved essential in identifying the full scope of the hostile intelligence penetration. Working with Colonel Vance and a hastily assembled security team, she traced the sabotage device's communication pathways to reveal a network of surveillance equipment that had been systematically installed throughout the base's most sensitive facilities. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. Foreign intelligence services had been collecting classified information from Fort Meridian for at least 2 years. The investigation revealed that 3 base personnel had been compromised through a combination of financial incentives and personal blackmail. 2 were enlisted personnel with access to communication systems, and 1 was a civilian contractor who had been providing intelligence about base security procedures and personnel schedules. Elena's months of careful observation had identified behavioral patterns that led directly to exposing the hostile network. More disturbing was Elena's discovery that the intelligence operation had been designed to support a planned physical attack on Fort Meridian's weapons storage facilities. The sabotage devices weren't just collecting information, they were preparing the base's defenses for systematic failure that would allow hostile forces to penetrate the installation and seize classified weapons and technology. Elena's intervention had prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach with national implications. The weapons stored at Fort Meridian included advanced systems that foreign adversaries had been unable to acquire through other means. The planned attack would have provided hostile intelligence services with access to technologies that could have fundamentally altered global military balance. But Elena's success in neutralizing the immediate threat came with personal costs that she had learned to accept during her years of classified service. Her cover had been blown in a way that made it impossible to return to the quiet anonymity she had maintained for 8 months. Personnel who had worked with her daily now knew her true identity, making future covert operations at Fort Meridian impossible. The psychological adjustment was complex for Elena. After months of suppressing her real capabilities and enduring mockery for her apparent limitations, suddenly being recognized for her actual competence created emotional conflicts that she struggled to process. The validation was satisfying, but it also meant the end of a mission that had become important to her. On a personal level, Elena had genuinely come to care about the personnel at Fort Meridian, even those who had treated her dismissively. Her protective instincts had been engaged by the knowledge that these people were facing threats they couldn't recognize. Completing her mission successfully meant ensuring their safety, but it also meant leaving them behind as she moved on to the next classified assignment. The base personnel who had worked most closely with Elena experienced their own complex emotions. As her departure approached, many felt guilty about their previous treatment of her, wanting to apologize for assumptions and behaviors that now seemed petty and ignorant. But Elena's professional demeanor made personal conversations difficult. She remained focused on completing her security mission rather than processing interpersonal relationships. Private Thompson, who had been most vocal in mocking Elena's appearance, attempted to apologize during one of their final interactions. Elena's response was characteristically direct. "Your behavior was consistent with maintaining my cover identity. Personal feelings aren't relevant to mission success." The words were professional, but Thompson detected underlying hurt that made his guilt more profound. Colonel Vance found himself in the unusual position of preparing efficiency reports for someone whose actual service record he wasn't authorized to access. Elena's performance during the security crisis had been exceptional, but documenting her contributions required careful language that acknowledged her competence without revealing classified details about her background or mission. The base commander, General Blackwater, made a point of personally thanking Elena for her service, but their conversation was constrained by security protocols that prevented detailed discussion of Elena's background or the full scope of her investigation. The formal recognition felt inadequate given the magnitude of Elena's contribution to base security. Elena's departure preparations were as methodical as everything else she did. Her maintenance contractor workspace was cleaned to standards that eliminated any trace of her presence. Her equipment was returned to supply channels, and her documentation was organized for transfer to her replacement. The efficiency was impressive, but it also highlighted how completely Elena could erase herself from environments where she had worked for months. The classified debriefing process required Elena to provide comprehensive analysis of security vulnerabilities she had identified beyond the immediate threat that had forced her revelation. Her recommendations would result in significant changes to Fort Meridian security procedures, personnel vetting processes, and physical protection systems. Elena's 8 months of observation had provided insights that would improve base security for years to come, but Elena's most significant contribution was educational. Her presence at Fort Meridian had taught personnel to recognize that military service took many forms, that competence didn't always match expectations, and that assumptions about civilian contractors could create dangerous security blind spots. The lessons learned from Elena's mission would be incorporated into security training throughout the military. Elena's final day at Fort Meridian was deliberately low-key. She completed her security debriefings, transferred her responsibilities to incoming personnel, and prepared for departure without ceremonies or formal recognition that might compromise operational security for future missions. Most base personnel learned of her departure only after she had already left. The farewell that mattered most to Elena was private. Colonel Vance met with her in the base commander's office for a classified conversation that allowed them to speak openly about her mission and its implications. Vance expressed admiration for Elena's professional competence and personal courage in maintaining her cover while investigating serious threats to base security. "Major Kovac," Vance said, using her real rank for the first time in front of witnesses, "your service here prevented a security disaster that could have had national implications. The personnel at this base owe you their safety, even if most of them will never know it." Elena's response reflected the professional distance that had protected her through years of classified service. "The mission was successful, Colonel. Personal recognition isn't necessary for mission completion." But when Elena left Colonel Vance's office, she paused at the door and looked back at the base that had been her home for 8 months. The buildings, the personnel, the routines that had become familiar would soon be memories as she moved on to the next assignment that would require her to become someone else entirely. Elena's departure from Fort Meridian was as unremarkable as her arrival had been. She drove through the main gate in her weathered Honda Civic, presented her final credentials to the guard, and disappeared into civilian traffic without fanfare. To casual observers, she looked like any contractor completing a routine assignment, but Elena Kovac was already mentally preparing for her next mission. Somewhere else, another classified investigation required someone who could blend into civilian environments while conducting sophisticated intelligence operations. The faded uniform that had generated so much mockery was carefully packed away, ready to be replaced by whatever civilian identity her next assignment would require. The base she left behind was more secure because of her presence, but Elena had learned long ago not to dwell on gratitude that couldn't be publicly expressed. Her satisfaction came from mission completion, not from recognition that would compromise the operational security essential to her continuing service. Fort Meridian would remember Elena Kovac, if at all, as the maintenance contractor who had helped expose a serious security threat. But Elena's real legacy would be measured in threats prevented, lives protected, and national security preserved through service that would always remain classified. In the weeks following Elena's departure, Fort Meridian settled into new routines, shaped by hard-learned lessons about assumptions, respect, and the true nature of service. The base that had once operated with casual certainty about who belonged and who didn't had been fundamentally changed by 8 months in the presence of someone whose greatest strength had been her ability to appear unremarkable. The most profound transformation occurred in how personnel evaluated each other and the civilian contractors who worked among them. Gone was the automatic dismissal of anyone who didn't fit conventional military appearance standards. Security briefings now included specific training about recognizing that competence takes many forms and that military service in the modern era often requires personnel to operate under civilian cover for legitimate operational purposes. Private Thompson, who had been most vocal in his mockery of Elena's appearance, became an unexpected advocate for treating all personnel with professional respect, regardless of their apparent status. During training sessions with new recruits, Thompson would share the story of Elena's true identity as a lesson about the dangers of making assumptions based on surface appearances. "The person you think doesn't belong might be the one person keeping you safe," became his standard warning to soldiers who showed signs of dismissive attitudes toward support staff. Sergeant Rodriguez implemented new protocols for his unit that emphasized the importance of maintaining security awareness even when interacting with familiar personnel. Elena's investigation had revealed that casual conversations and careless behavior around civilian contractors had created security vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services had been able to exploit. Rodriguez's soldiers learned that operational security wasn't just about protecting classified information, it was about recognizing that every interaction could have security implications. The dining facility staff who had treated Elena with condescending courtesy developed new appreciation for the complexity of military service that extended beyond traditional combat roles. Sergeant Walsh instituted training for his personnel about the various forms military service could take, emphasizing that someone's contribution to national security couldn't be measured by their rank insignia or uniform appearance. Colonel Vance found himself serving as an informal educator for other senior officers who visited Fort Meridian. Elena's mission had provided lessons that extended far beyond base security. It demonstrated how modern threats required defensive capabilities that relied on personnel who could operate effectively while concealing their military status. Vance's briefings to visiting commanders emphasized that identifying and supporting such personnel required leaders who could recognize exceptional capability, even when it was deliberately hidden. The base's junior officers received perhaps the most valuable education from Elena's revelation. Lieutenant Summers and her peers learned that their military academy training, while comprehensive, had prepared them for conventional leadership challenges, but hadn't equipped them to recognize unconventional excellence. The incident with Elena became a case study in military leadership courses about the importance of maintaining open minds about personnel capabilities and avoiding assumptions that could blind leaders to the resources available to them. The maintenance staff who had worked most closely with Elena experienced ongoing reminders of her exceptional competence. Equipment that Elena had modified or repaired continued to operate at levels that exceeded manufacturer specifications, providing daily evidence of her advanced technical capabilities. New maintenance contractors were inevitably compared to Elena's standards, usually unfavorably, creating appreciation for the level of expertise she had brought to her cover assignment. Command Sergeant Major Hayes incorporated Elena's story into his mentorship of senior enlisted personnel throughout the region. His message was direct and practical. Exceptional people often worked hard to appear ordinary, and leaders who couldn't recognize hidden excellence were failing in their fundamental responsibility to identify and utilize the best capabilities of their personnel. The security improvements implemented based on Elena's recommendations transformed Fort Meridian into a model installation for counterintelligence awareness. Other bases sent personnel to study Fort Meridian's enhanced security procedures, spreading lessons learned from Elena's investigation throughout the military. Her 8 months of careful observation had identified vulnerabilities that were common to military installations worldwide. But the most significant change at Fort Meridian was cultural. Personnel learned to value substance over appearance, competence over conformity, and quiet professionalism over dramatic displays of capability. Elena's example demonstrated the most dangerous enemies were those who looked harmless, and conversely, that the most valuable allies were often those who chose not to advertise their capabilities. The story of Elena Kovac became part of Fort Meridian's institutional memory, passed down to new personnel as a lesson about the importance of maintaining respectful professionalism toward everyone who served on the base. The woman in the faded uniform who had fixed their equipment while investigating threats to their safety became a symbol of service that required no recognition to be meaningful. Young soldiers learned that heroism didn't always wear the uniform they expected. Sometimes it wore work boots and carried a toolkit. Sometimes it endured mockery while secretly protecting the people who delivered that mockery. Sometimes it chose invisibility because the mission was more important than personal recognition. The medals that Alina had kept hidden beneath her jacket represented more than personal achievement. They symbolized service that prioritized mission success over personal glory. Personnel at Fort Meridian learned that the most decorated soldiers were often those whose decorations couldn't be displayed, whose achievements couldn't be discussed, and whose contributions to national security would never be publicly acknowledged. Alina's legacy extended beyond Fort Meridian, through the personnel who transferred to other assignments, carrying lessons learned from their interaction with her. Officers, NCOs, and enlisted personnel spread awareness about the importance of recognizing that military service took many forms and that assumptions about civilian contractors could create dangerous security vulnerabilities. The practical implications were significant. Military installations worldwide modified their security procedures based on lessons learned from Alina's investigation. Contractor vetting processes were enhanced, security awareness training was expanded, and personnel learned to maintain operational security awareness, even when interacting with familiar support staff. More fundamentally, Alina's story became part of the broader conversation about modern military service and the sacrifices required by personnel who served in classified capacities. The isolation, the psychological stress of maintaining false identities, and the inability to receive public recognition for exceptional service were challenges that more military personnel faced as national security threats became increasingly sophisticated. Alina Kovac had demonstrated that strength didn't need to announce itself, that competence didn't require recognition, and that the most effective service was often that which remained invisible. Her 8 months at Fort Meridian proved that true professionals measured their success by mission completion rather than personal acknowledgement. The maintenance shed where Alina had worked was eventually assigned to a new contractor, but personnel who remembered her insisted on maintaining the organizational standards and operational procedures she had established. Her workspace became an unofficial memorial to professional excellence that served without expectation of reward. Alina's story reminded everyone who heard it that the world was protected by people whose names would never be known, whose faces would never be recognized, and whose sacrifices would never be publicly acknowledged. They were the guardians who chose invisibility because their missions required it, who endured disrespect because their covers demanded it, and who found satisfaction in preventing disasters that the people they protected would never know had been threatened. The next time you encounter someone who seems ordinary, remember Alina Kovac. Remember that the person fixing your equipment might be the one preventing catastrophic failures. Remember that the quiet professional who avoids attention might be the one ensuring your safety. Remember that true strength whispers while weakness shouts. Heroes don't always wear the uniforms we expect. Sometimes they wear faded jackets that hide medals no one is allowed to see. Sometimes they choose to be forgotten because being remembered would compromise their ability to protect others. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are those who work hardest to appear ordinary. Honor the quiet professionals who serve without recognition, who sacrifice personal glory for mission success, and who protect our security through service that must remain invisible. Their strength lies not in being seen, but in ensuring that others can live safely while never knowing how close danger came. Type respect if you believe the greatest heroes are often the ones whose names we'll never know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.